If there's one conversation I find myself having over and over again on Avoidant Decoded, it's probably not the one most people expect. Yes, I spend a lot of time explaining why avoidants pull away, why they suddenly go silent, and how someone can recover after experiencing that kind of relationship. Those are important discussions, and they deserve attention. But there is another question that people ask far more quietly. It's the question they often carry for months, sometimes even years, because they can't seem to find an answer that truly settles it. They want to know whether the avoidant genuinely formed an emotional bond with them. Was the connection real? Did the relationship ever reach a place of authentic attachment for the avoidant? Or was it only something temporary, something shallow that looked meaningful, but was never deeply rooted in the first place? This uncertainty is often far more painful than the breakup itself. After working with countless people who have loved someone with an avoidant attachment style, I've noticed a pattern that appears again and again. Their greatest struggle isn't simply accepting that the relationship ended. It's trying to understand whether what they experienced actually mattered to the other person. They remember moments that felt incredibly intimate, conversations that seemed deeply personal, times when they believed they had reached a level of closeness unlike anything either of them had shared before. Then everything changed. Distance replaced closeness. Silence replaced communication. The avoidant withdrew, and their behavior began telling a story that completely contradicted the one the relationship had once seemed to tell. Now the person left behind is trapped between two realities. One part of them remembers a connection that felt genuine beyond words. The other part looks at the avoidant's withdrawal and wonders if none of it was ever real. Those two experiences refuse to fit together, creating a level of emotional confusion that can be incredibly difficult to escape. Today, I want to help make sense of that contradiction, not by offering empty reassurance. Comfort without evidence fades quickly. Real understanding comes from recognizing the psychological patterns that actually exist. And when it comes to avoidant attachment, those patterns rarely resemble what most people expect. The biggest mistake people make is assuming that emotional bonding should look the same for everyone. It doesn't. An avoidant who has formed a deep attachment often expresses it in ways that look completely different from someone with a secure attachment style. If you're using the wrong framework to interpret their behavior, you can overlook genuine signs of attachment repeatedly without ever realizing what you're seeing. Before we explore the specific phrases an avoidant tends to say once they've truly bonded, it's important to understand what bonding actually feels like from their perspective. Because without that foundation, the words themselves lose much of their meaning. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, bonding isn't usually experienced as a slow, comforting journey toward greater intimacy. It rarely feels peaceful. It rarely feels exciting. In many cases, it feels threatening. Not because their partner has crossed boundaries or done something harmful, but because the avoidant's internal world has spent years learning that emotional dependence is dangerous. Their emotional defenses didn't appear overnight. They were built carefully over many years. Each painful experience strengthened those walls until self-protection became automatic. At a level they may not even consciously recognize, many avoidants believe those barriers are what keep them safe from repeating earlier emotional wounds. So when someone eventually reaches them, despite all those defenses, something extraordinary happens. The connection doesn't simply stay on the surface. It reaches beneath the protective layers and settles somewhere much deeper. For an avoidant, this is an incredibly rare psychological experience. Ironically, it often doesn't feel romantic in the way most people imagine love should feel. Instead, it can feel unsettling, almost like discovering that someone has become emotionally essential before they ever intended to let that happen. It's as though one day they suddenly realize another person has quietly become part of the emotional structure holding up their inner world, and they don't remember giving permission for that to happen. That realization can feel overwhelming, and because it feels overwhelming, it changes the way they communicate. Rather than expressing affection through obvious declarations or dramatic confessions, they often reveal their attachment in subtle ways that are easy to miss unless you understand what you're looking at. One of the earliest signs often comes disguised as self-criticism. Instead of talking about how much you mean to them, they begin talking about their own shortcomings. You might hear things like, "I'm not very good at relationships. I've always handled life better on my own. I don't really know how to do this. I'm probably going to mess this up." At first glance, these statements may sound like casual observations or even insecurity. But psychologically, they often represent something much more significant. I've touched on this kind of communication before, but within the context of genuine emotional bonding, it carries far greater importance. When an avoidant voluntarily admits their own emotional limitations without being pressured, criticized, or questioned, they are doing something that doesn't come naturally to them. They are lowering defenses that have protected them for years. That kind of honesty isn't offered casually. What they're really doing in that moment is allowing you to glimpse a part of themselves they normally work very hard to keep hidden. They're not exposing every layer of the wound. They're revealing it cautiously, almost indirectly. Instead of making a dramatic confession, they slip it into the conversation through a quiet, self-critical remark that feels both sincere and easy to take back if necessary. This approach serves two purposes at once. It lets them communicate something deeply true about themselves while still preserving an escape route if their honesty isn't met with understanding. They can always pretend it wasn't important if the response feels unsafe. So how do you know this is a sign of genuine attachment rather than simple insecurity or emotional distancing? Pay attention to what happens immediately afterward. There is often a subtle pause. It may only last a few seconds, but during that silence, their nervous system is carefully watching you. They're observing whether you respond with judgment, pressure, or acceptance. From the outside, it may seem insignificant. Internally, however, it's a critical moment. They've placed something emotionally real between you, and they're waiting to discover whether you'll handle it with care or unintentionally reinforce the reasons they've learned to keep their guard up. If your response is calm, compassionate, and doesn't immediately shift into fixing them or demanding even greater vulnerability, something important begins happening inside the avoidance emotional system. Their brain quietly records a new experience. It learns that being emotionally honest didn't lead to rejection. It also learns that closeness didn't immediately become overwhelming or controlling. For perhaps one of the first times, vulnerability feels survivable. That single experience often strengthens the bond more than either person realizes, even if the conversation quickly moves on and neither of you ever mentions it again. The second phrase I've repeatedly noticed from avoidants who have already formed a genuine attachment is something I think of as selective emotional memory. Here's how it usually unfolds. Months earlier, you casually mentioned something during an ordinary conversation. At the time, it felt completely forgettable. You assumed it disappeared as quickly as it was spoken. Then, unexpectedly, the avoidant brings it up. Not vaguely, not approximately. They remember the exact detail, the specific story, the precise wording. And suddenly you realize they weren't simply listening that day. They carried that memory with them long afterward. To me, this is one of the strongest, yet most overlooked signs of genuine bonding. Avoidants generally become very skilled at controlling how emotionally invested they appear in relationships. They're present enough to participate, yet emotionally regulated enough to avoid feeling completely exposed. Because of that, they don't usually store countless personal details about everyone they meet. When someone hasn't reached an important place in their emotional world, those conversations tend to fade naturally. But when attachment has quietly formed, something changes. Your words begin staying with them. Without consciously deciding to, they replay certain conversations, revisit specific moments, and continue thinking about things you've shared long after the interaction has ended. So when they unexpectedly recall something you had completely forgotten saying, what you're witnessing isn't simply a good memory. You're seeing evidence that your inner world has continued occupying space inside theirs. Those details remained alive because, somewhere beneath their defenses, you remained emotionally present. Even during periods when they appeared distant on the outside, your connection often continued unfolding privately within them. The reason they remembered isn't because they forced themselves to. It's because your presence had already become psychologically significant enough that your words kept returning to them on their own. Without consciously planning it, they had begun organizing parts of their emotional world around someone they never intended to depend on. The third statement avoidants often make after genuine attachment has formed can be surprisingly difficult to recognize because, on the surface, it doesn't look emotionally meaningful at all. It appears through what I call quiet future references. These moments are subtle. They're woven naturally into everyday conversation. The avoidant might casually mention a restaurant they'd like you to try together someday. They might talk about a destination they hope you'll eventually visit with them. Or they may describe a future experience and include you in it almost as an afterthought. There isn't a dramatic declaration. There isn't a formal commitment. It's simply a future moment, with you already included. For someone with a secure attachment style, this kind of conversation is completely ordinary. When people feel close, they naturally picture tomorrow together. They imagine shared experiences without thinking twice about it. For an avoidant, however, this isn't casual at all. Including another person in their future requires crossing an internal boundary their attachment system has spent years protecting. An avoidant who hasn't emotionally bonded usually imagines tomorrow as something entirely self-contained. Their future exists independently. It belongs only to them. No one else's presence is assumed. The emotional walls they've built don't just limit intimacy in the present, they also protect the future from becoming emotionally dependent on anyone else. So when they spontaneously place you inside their vision of what's ahead, they're communicating something far deeper than the words themselves suggest. Without directly saying, "You've become important to me," they're expressing it in the language that feels safest. They're quietly revealing that you've already found a place inside the emotional world they once believed belonged only to them. You've become part of the picture they carry forward. The fourth sign may be one of the strongest indicators of genuine attachment, yet it's also one of the easiest to overlook because it rarely appears dramatic on the surface. I call this the protected disclosure. This is the moment an avoidant shares something they've never truly revealed to anyone else. It doesn't always come as a life-changing confession or an emotionally charged revelation. In fact, it's often much quieter than that. It could be an old fear they've carried in silence for years, a childhood experience they've never spoken aloud, a deeply personal belief, an insecurity, or simply a part of themselves they've always kept hidden, because exposing it has never felt emotionally safe. To anyone else, the conversation may seem ordinary. To the avoidant, it feels anything but ordinary. They're handing you access to a private space inside themselves that almost no one has ever entered. What's fascinating is the way they usually do it. They rarely present it with dramatic emotion or obvious vulnerability. Instead, they'll often soften the moment with humor, change the subject immediately afterward, or downplay what they just revealed. It's a protective strategy. By minimizing the significance of the disclosure, they leave themselves an emotional escape if the response doesn't feel safe. If they're misunderstood, dismissed, or judged, they can convince themselves, and perhaps even you, that it wasn't really important after all. But internally, they know it was. And that's exactly why this moment matters so much. The true cost isn't simply talking about a difficult subject. The real cost is allowing one section of their emotional defenses to lower. Think of it as removing a single brick from a wall they've spent years carefully maintaining. That opening may appear small, but psychologically it's enormous. It represents trust overcoming fear, even if only for a brief moment. If your presence is what made that level of openness feel possible, you've likely reached a place inside them that very few people ever do. That isn't casual vulnerability. It's often one of the clearest signs that a deep emotional bond has already formed. The fifth signal may surprise many people because, at first glance, it looks like the exact opposite of love. In reality, it can sometimes be one of its strongest indicators. I'm referring to the personal push-away. Before I explain this, it's important to approach it carefully. Many people have been deeply hurt by an avoidance withdrawal, and nothing I'm about to say excuses unhealthy behavior or minimizes that pain. Instead, it helps explain the psychology behind a very specific kind of distancing. Not all avoidance looks the same. There's the ordinary need for space that many avoidants maintain throughout relationships. Then there's another kind of withdrawal altogether. This second version appears when the emotional connection has grown so significant that their nervous system begins treating intimacy itself as a threat. At that point, the retreat becomes urgent, almost instinctive. Instead of quietly creating distance without explanation, they begin connecting that distance directly to you. You may hear statements such as, "You make me feel too much. I don't know how to handle this with you. Being with you is becoming overwhelming." Notice the difference. They're not speaking about relationships in general. They're speaking about you, your presence, your impact, the emotions that exist specifically because of your connection. Someone who hasn't formed a meaningful attachment usually doesn't need to personalize their withdrawal. They simply become unavailable. They disappear emotionally or physically without much explanation because there isn't a deep internal conflict to resolve. But when genuine attachment exists, the conflict becomes impossible to ignore. Their nervous system recognizes that something about this relationship has crossed a line they never expected. And although they may not fully understand it themselves, they instinctively identify you as the source of that emotional upheaval. Paradoxically, their explanation reveals exactly what they're trying to escape. Not intimacy in the abstract, not commitment as a general concept, but the emotional weight of loving you in particular. That doesn't make the withdrawal healthy, nor does it erase the hurt it causes. But psychologically, it communicates something important. It reveals that your presence has become powerful enough to shake the internal structure they've relied upon for years. In many cases, that's why the retreat feels so intense. Finally, there's a sixth sign that's slightly different from everything we've discussed so far. Unlike the previous examples, this one isn't primarily expressed through words. It's revealed through actions. However, those actions are usually accompanied by subtle language that gives them deeper meaning, which is why I believe they belong in this conversation. I call this unprompted protection. I've mentioned this idea before on Avoidant Decoded, but within the context of genuine emotional bonding, its importance deserves a closer look. When an avoidant becomes deeply attached, something begins changing beneath the surface. Without consciously deciding to, they start paying close attention to your well-being. Their care often appears in practical, almost understated ways. They remember things you've forgotten. They anticipate situations that might create unnecessary stress for you. They quietly look for ways to make your day easier, solve small problems before you notice them, or reduce burdens without drawing attention to what they're doing. What's remarkable is that these gestures usually happen without being requested. They're not performed to earn praise. They're not attempts to impress you. Instead, they arise naturally because your welfare has become emotionally important to them. That level of awareness doesn't develop through casual interest. What makes these protective actions even more meaningful is the way avoidants usually talk about them afterward. More often than not, they'll go out of their way to make what they did seem completely unimportant. They'll notice exactly what you need, quietly take care of it, and then immediately dismiss the effort as though it barely deserved acknowledgement. They might say things like, "It wasn't a big deal," or "anyone would have done the same." That reaction isn't accidental. It's part of the defense. Someone who feels emotionally detached has no reason to minimize an act that never carried emotional weight in the first place. But an avoidant who has developed a genuine bond often feels the need to soften the significance of their own care. They want to express it while also protecting themselves from what expressing it reveals. So they offer something deeply meaningful, then wrap it in ordinary language, almost inviting you not to notice how much thought actually went into it. Don't focus only on the explanation. Pay attention to the behavior. The words are often protecting them. The action is usually telling the truth. Before we finish, there's something important I want to address. Everything we've discussed today, the vulnerable admissions, the remarkable memory for personal details, the subtle future planning, the deeply personal disclosures, the emotionally charged withdrawal, and the quiet acts of protection, points toward one question. Did the avoidant truly bond? In many situations, these patterns strongly suggest they did. But that understanding also carries a risk. The danger is believing that evidence of attachment automatically means you should continue waiting for the relationship to become what you hoped it would be. I understand why that temptation exists. When you've spent months or even years questioning whether the relationship meant as much to them as it did to you, discovering signs that your connection was genuine can feel incredibly validating. It's like finally receiving an answer you've been searching for during a very long period of uncertainty. Naturally, part of you may want to hold on to that answer as proof that everything can still work out. But that's where an important distinction has to be made. These signs can confirm that the emotional connection was real. They can suggest that you weren't imagining the closeness. They can explain why certain moments felt unusually significant. The careful attention they gave your words, the deeply personal things they eventually trusted you with, the unexpected ways they looked after you. All of those experiences may genuinely reflect a bond that reached far beneath the surface. What they do not automatically prove is that the relationship was emotionally sustainable. Those are two completely different realities. Someone can form a powerful emotional attachment while still lacking the emotional regulation, self-awareness, or healing necessary to consistently maintain a healthy partnership. In other words, the bond may have been genuine, the feelings may have been genuine, and yet their ability to live out those feelings in a stable, dependable relationship may still have been missing. All three realities can exist together. Recognizing that complexity is often one of the most honest and emotionally freeing perspectives you can hold. As we close today's conversation, I want to leave you with one final thought. Learning that an avoidant genuinely bonded with you doesn't lower the standard of love you deserve. It doesn't erase the responsibility they had to communicate, remain emotionally available, or build a relationship capable of meeting both people's needs. It doesn't mean you're supposed to wait indefinitely while hoping they'll eventually overcome defenses they haven't yet chosen to address. What it can change is the story you've been telling yourself. Maybe you've wondered if your intuition failed you. Maybe you've questioned whether you invented the depth you believed you saw. Maybe you've blamed yourself for caring too much or trusting too deeply. I don't believe that's the most accurate interpretation. If the signs we've explored today describe your experience, then it's entirely possible your instincts weren't misleading you at all. You recognized an authentic emotional connection before the other person had the capacity to fully understand or consistently express it themselves. That doesn't mean the relationship could have survived in its existing form, but it does mean your perception wasn't necessarily the problem. You weren't imagining every meaningful moment. You weren't creating intimacy out of wishful thinking. The connection you sensed may very well have existed. The difficult reality is that someone can feel something profoundly and still lack the emotional capacity to remain present inside those feelings. That's an important distinction because it protects you from believing that your ability to love deeply is somehow a weakness. It isn't. Your willingness to build genuine emotional closeness is not something you should become suspicious of. It's one of your greatest strengths. Whether the avoidant eventually learns to face the bond they formed, or spends years quietly carrying it beneath the defenses they return to, that part of the story belongs to them. Your responsibility is different. Your responsibility is to honor what you experienced, learn from it, and continue moving toward relationships where deep emotional connection is matched by equal emotional availability. Because real love isn't measured only by the depth of the bond, it's measured by the willingness and ability to consistently show up for it. And that's something you deserve every single time.